In my last video, we looked at the new ships of the UEE fleet in the CitizenCon 2953 I Held the Line trailer for Squadron 42. But now, let's look at the people inside those ships, as this new trailer reveals a fairly significant update to uniforms, rank insignias, and roles within the UEE Navy. I'm going to first look at the changes, so if you're just interested in seeing a rundown of the known ranks and known rank insignias, check the chapters to skip to the relevant section. This video may contain some mild spoilers from Squadron 42 that are revealed in publicly released material, but will contain no leaks. The main officer's uniform of the UEE Navy has undergone some subtle but significant changes since the cinematic tease of 2018 and the vertical slice of 2017. Some of these changes have been teased by the in-game uniforms worn by the crew of the UES Warhammer during Invictus, in an episode of Around the Verse called The Living Idris, and by sneak peeks in official videos. Officer uniforms now have a strap at the right shoulder and a cloth rank insignia shoulder where previously it was leather. Where previously the whole sleeve was darker, now it is only the inner surface and the outer is the same blue as the torso. Where in 2018 and before there was a gold dog collar element and sneak peeks from the 2020s replaced this with collar pips, now the collar is simplified with no metallic devices at all, a broader gap and a visible ribbed white collar underneath, probably from like a t-shirt that we've seen. The medal placard underneath the naval badge has been removed entirely, and rank insignias have also been redesigned, which we'll explore later in detail. The belt, which was originally a UEE logo on the buckle, has been removed entirely. Of these changes, I mostly like them. I preferred the textural difference of the leather shoulder, and I think the undershirt is too visible now, which robs it of some gravitas, but removing the collar pips, belt, and particularly the medals is a nice simplification. Unless they were going to make the medals and pips signify something, it didn't really add much, and I'm very glad that we're not going to have the Admiral with loads and loads of metal around their neck. And it appears that these really old uniforms have actually been repurposed as historical UPE uniforms from the First Vietnam War. One of the biggest changes is who wears which coloured officer's uniform. In previous materials, the Stanton crew had a more teal coloured uniform, where the crews of the Gauntlet and the Krugeri had a deeper blue. Ranks Commander and above had gold insignias, piping and badges, while below had silver. And both the player and Mark Hamill's character, Colton, wear a colour inverted uniform relative to the rest of the officers. In the new trailer, Colton and the player are the only ones seen wearing silver livery, on a lighter blue uniform relative to Mark Strong's captain character, and all other officers on the bridge of the capital ships Krugeri and Stanton have changed to the dark blue and gold. It's not clear at this point what the final intent is. My expectation is that the lighter blue and silver will be just for naval aviators like Colton and the player character, with blue and gold for the majority of the officers. I think it's a great idea to add a clear visual identifier to this separate class of officers, as the previous colour inversion was so easy to overlook that I really only noticed it while making this video. One of the changes I found most interesting was the update pass to the flight deck crew. Where previously they were all in the same uniforms, there is now a colour coding reminiscent of real-life carrier deck crews, and this appears to have a functional translation into what they do to your craft. We see a crewman in red inspecting the craft's weapons, matching the designation for US Navy Ordnance Specialists, and someone in purple moving a fuel hose, matching the real-world fueling specialists. We see dark green, yellow and white working around the craft without any specific function displayed yet, and it's a crew member in yellow coordinating the launch of your Gladius. And Chief Engineer Petty Officer Webster wears a brown version of this uniform, in line with US Navy Air Wing line leading petty officers. I love what this adds to the richness of the launch sequence, and CIG are quite right to be proud of what it adds. I don't think we've seen any really big changes to the jumpsuits, marine uniforms, or off-duty uniforms since the previous videos, though we do see a new look at the medic characters. There have been refinements to the flight suit worn by the player and Colton, and I like how Colton's name is nicely visible on the front of his suit. Hopefully the player's name will be featured on their armour in the final version. Let's move on to rank insignias. One thing that's very notable in the latest video is that most characters have 3 bars on their shoulder board irrespective of rank, where previously it featured something similar to the rank stripes on their sleeve. There's one person with 2 bars which Dargenator kindly pointed out to me. I don't know whether I would really read into this though, as it could be just that you have 3 bars above a certain rank, or it could be that it's just one of the unfinished areas of their costume. It looks from the vertical slice that the sleeve rank and shoulder boards were sort of modelled separately to the underlying tunic, and it's possible that it's just a matter of making and switching in the correct ones and they haven't done that yet. For the purpose of most of this video, I'm going to go on what we see, but it's an area where I anticipate seeing changes. Let's go through the ranks as they currently stand. We know the updated rank structure from Lawmakers Community Questions of September 2021. I'm going to try to pair up each rank with something we see in the videos, taking preference from the most recent videos. Where there are gaps or inconsistencies in the officer ranks, I'm going to err on the side of copying US Navy insignias, as it seems to be the main source for most of their copying. Admirals and enlisted don't seem to conform as closely, but it's pretty good for most of the officers. Because there's gaps and inconsistencies, I'll indicate at the bottom whether I think we have a confident identification, a person of known rank has a clearly visible image, an assumed identification, there's a small discrepancy or we're piecing together information, or an imagined insignia. We know the rank exists, we haven't seen it, and we're just filling it in this gap with what we have available. It's pretty reliable in some places, less reliable in others. As mentioned in the previous section, I'm representing the shoulder boards as seen in the recent videos, despite my belief that this will receive a further update. Bishop is the only admiral we've seen, and his insignia consists of 4 bands with upward devices on 3 of them. His shoulder boards are uniquely chevron shaped rather than bar shaped, and his uniform is a unique grey colour. We haven't seen Grand, Vice and Rear Admirals, but based on the differences between Admiral Bishop and the captains, I anticipate that the chevron shoulder boards and the number of upward arrows on the sleeve will denote the difference between the different admiral ranks. We haven't seen a Commodore rank, and this is my first big piece of guesswork. We do see a sort of half stripe at certain ranks, so I'm kind of copying that as a 4.5 stripe rank above captain. We see 3 captains, each of whom have 4 stripes. In one scene, Mark Strong is missing the star device above his rank stripes, but in another scene he has it, so I'm not reading into that as a meaningful difference. The only 3-stripe officer we see is Sophia Kelly, the executive officer at the Stanton. She has been described as a lieutenant commander before in the Morrow Tour, but as this rank insignia matches that of a commander of the US Navy, and we see other known lieutenant commanders wearing different insignias, and her position as an XO would seem to fit that of a commander, I think we can assume that she's now been promoted to being a commander in the plot of Squadron 42. Colton is a lieutenant commander in the silver and lighter blue uniform with 2.5 stripes, which, as I mentioned, I believe is reserved for aviators. We see the same insignia in blue and gold on the deck of the Stanton, and UES Stanton flight operator Aaron Seatow, who previously was seen wearing the same uniform as Colton, is now in the blue and gold, so presumably also wears this uniform. We see a number of 2-stripe officers, which I assume are lieutenants. Our player is seen wearing this rank in silver and lighter blue during the meeting with Cal Mason, and the vertical slice saw as being referred to as lieutenant. It's also seen in dark blue and gold on the bridge crew of the Krigeri and the Stanton. We see one person with a 2-bar shoulder board, so I'm assuming that this is the correct shoulder board for this rank across both colours. You can't really clearly see the shoulder board of any other person at this rank. We don't see any Lieutenant Junior grades in the recent video, but in the 2018 Living Idris video we can see someone whose rank insignia most closely resembles the US Navy equivalent, or sort of 1.5 stripe. And so I've made an assumed version of how that would fit within the visual style of what we've seen so far. We also don't see any ensigns, but following the same pattern as the above ranks, this would be the most likely design. Moving on to the enlisted ranks, all of which bear their rank on a hexagonal patch and don't seem to necessarily have associated shoulder boards. For all of these, I'm not confident that we have any confident identifications, because where we know people's rank, we can't necessarily see their patch, and where we can see their patch, we don't know their rank. So it's all a bit supposition. It's probably best to first map out what designs we can see, and then try to reconstruct the rank structure from there. The most elaborate patch we see is the Armourer, who bears 3 upward chevrons, 1 downward chevron, and the star device in the centre. Chief Engineer Carol Webster was introduced to us in the Morrow Tour as a petty officer. Another graphic in the vertical slice calls her a lieutenant, but as her rank patch is clearly that of the enlisted, and that wasn't a voiced line, I think we can disregard that graphic. We can see her patch has 3 chevrons and what appears to be some sort of device underneath it that's a bit wider. We see a 3 chevron patch with no device on the sleeve of one of the deck crew, and then the player character at the start and all of the other enlisted we can see have 2 chevrons. We have previously seen single chevrons on the vertical slice. In the US forces, the lowest recruit ranks don't get any insignia, and that might be the case in the UEE Navy. However, it does appear that our character is a starman at the start, based on their Moby Glass comm screen. Accepting this, it seems like that these 3 ranks can be elucidated. 2 stripes for a starman, that would mean 1 stripe is a starman recruit, and 3 stripes a leading starman. Given that the patch is more elaborate, it would seem that the armour is of higher rank than Petty Officer Webster. Usually, rank upgrades are additive to the insignia until you run out of space, and then maybe you're going to start altering the elements that are there for something that's more prestigious. So I surmise the element that we see on Webster's arm is probably just the star insignia we can see on the armourers, so the difference between the 2 is just the bottom stripe. That would probably make the armourer a Chief Petty Officer, as there's only like 1 additional step above. That still leaves the Master Chief and Junior Petty Officers on either side of these ranks, which we've not yet seen. To fill in the gap of Junior Petty Officer between the leading starman and Petty Officer, I think it's probably most likely there'd be an intermediate addition, perhaps a Silver Star insignia. And for an upgrade of Chief Petty Officer, I would suspect that they'd look to the example of US military ranks where the insignia is upgraded without changing the stripes, perhaps to the Navy Winged Anchor badge worn by officers on their chest. That's probably my biggest guess for the video. To summarise, I've put together graphics of all my levels of speculation. Here we can see the ranks that we can definitely see in the most recent video. Here, if we fill in the gaps with what we can be somewhat confident about. And here, my biggest speculations, including things like Commodore and Admirals. And finally, this is probably what they look like if the shoulder boards match these sleeves more closely. What I'd really love is if at the next Invictus they update the in-game assets with these uniforms, so we can see this kind of coming to life and see it mapping to something outside of Squadron 42. That would be my biggest beg to the developers. If you've enjoyed this, you might enjoy this other video or consider subscribing. I've been Jail, and I'll see you around the verse.